coming in here aware of what happened 2 nights ago? And that still happens?
What?
Absolutely unacceptable.
No, she didn't, dude.
Absolutely
she just
unacceptable.
cursed?
And the reckless closeout that they actually reviewed, and the foot still comes down on top of the defender's foot that wasn't upgraded? Absolutely disrespectful.
Officials allowed her the moment to get the emotions out of her, and some officials wouldn't do that.
Did you
Yeah, I got knee right in the quad. Like, that hurts. Like, the ref can't miss that. And then I have to play with a contusion in my leg the rest of the game. Like, it's ridiculous.
play with Stokes that made you upset, and then you hopped into the
Right in
back?
Quad. Like, that hurts. Like, the ref can't miss that. And then I have to play with a contusion in my leg the rest of the game. Like, it's ridiculous. Can't miss calls like that.
Did they give you an explanation right after when you
She
went up
said
to him?
I initiated the contact. Which is fine. You can't knee me in the leg, knock me over.
Talking to the official after that play, Caitlin got kneed in the quad and hopped off for a sec. Did they give you an explanation for the no color and how she did it?
No, they said Caitlin initiated the contact.
That's all they did.
That's all they said. She seems to always be initiating the contact.
Yeah, you mentioned Caitlin always seems to initiate the contact. Just what did you see in the officiating overall tonight, or just in general?
Chloe, I'm trying to not get fined. Again, all I'll say is that we just keep asking for consistency.
Anything else? All right, we'll end it there.
Isn't bullying, like, let's look at the NBA. Bullying on the court is a thing that has happened before.
It is a rite of
in
passage,
sports.
and it is a sign of respect. And for someone who doesn't know the game, for you to use certain words, we've got to be careful with our words. She's not getting beaten. She's not being bullied. No one's pulling her hair. No one's telling her she can't come out and play with them. That is a sign of respect. If I go at you because you're supposed to be a superstar, you're supposed to take it. Ask LeBron. Ask Michael Jordan. Ask the greats. It's a sign of respect. No one's bullying.
And when she gets asked, that's
And we have grown-ass men and women out here doing whatever they can to try to make sure that does not happen. That is the weirdest thing in the world, but it is what it is.
Picture this: 17,000 people on their feet. Home court. A player who has fought through a back injury, a minute's restriction, and weeks of physical punishment just to be on that floor. She makes the basket, takes a knee directly to the quad, crashes to the ground near the stanchion, gets up limping, and the referee standing right there calls absolutely nothing. And then, instead of an apology, instead of any acknowledgement that something went wrong, that same referee tells her she initiated the contact. That was the moment Caitlin Clark stopped being polite about it. What followed wasn't just a viral sideline outburst. It wasn't just another bad night for the Indiana Fever. What followed was the clearest, most undeniable evidence, yet that something is genuinely broken inside the WNBA, and that the people responsible for fixing it are either unwilling or completely unbothered. Millions of fans watched it happen in real time. Analysts lost their minds. And the league's response was so tone-deaf, it almost felt deliberate. This is the full story of what happened on July 15th, 2026, and why it matters far beyond one missed foul call. There are moments in sports where everything slows down, where you're watching something unfold and you already know, before it's even finished happening, that people are going to be talking about this for a long time. July 15th, 2026 was one of those moments, but not for any reason Indiana Fever fans would have wanted. The Fever were already in a tough spot heading into this game. They had just dropped out of sole possession of first place in the Eastern Conference. The Golden State Valkyries were coming in hot, sitting at 18-6, carrying the number 1 defense in the entire league. The crowd at Gainbridge Fieldhouse was loud, electric, desperate for a win. And Clark was out there, giving everything she had despite playing on a minute's restriction, that was already telling you everything you needed to know about where her body was at. Then it happened. Kia Stokes came in and kneed Clark directly in the quad. Not a brush. Not incidental contact that you could write off as two players going for the same space. A knee directly into the quad, hard enough to send Clark crashing to the floor near the stanchion. The kind of contact that makes you wince just watching it on a screen. The kind of contact that, if it happens to almost any other player in almost any other league, is a foul call before the player even hits the ground. Clark made the basket, she hit the floor, she got up limping. And the referee, who was standing right there, close enough that there is no reasonable universe in which he missed what happened, called absolutely nothing. Let that sit for a second. Clark absorbed a direct knee to the quad, went down, came up limping and got 0, not even a look, not even a pause in the action. Nothing. The game just kept going like it didn't happen. Now, most players in that situation take a breath, shake it off, and keep moving. Because that's the job. That's what professionals do, especially when you're playing on a minute's restriction with a back that's been in various stages of recovery for weeks. You absorb it and you move forward. Clark is not most players. She did what every single person watching at home was screaming for someone to do. She threw a fist in the air, made a direct line toward that referee, and said exactly what she was thinking, loudly enough for every camera in the building to catch it. "Give me a freaking call. I got fouled 5 times." The words weren't elegant. They weren't measured. They were real, they were raw, and they were completely earned. And the referee's response to a player who had just been kneed in the quad with no call, who had just made the basket anyway, who was now standing there with legitimate grievance written all over her face? A warning, not an apology, not an acknowledgement. A warning. To the player they had just watched take a knee to the leg with 0 whistle. But here is where it gets even more frustrating, because the non-call was only the beginning of the problem. After the game, Clark was asked about the play. No hedging, no careful media-trained language, no trying to protect herself from a fine. She said exactly what happened. She said Stokes hit her right in the quad. She said it hurts. She said the ref cannot miss that. And then she said she had to play the rest of the game with a contusion on her leg, and she called it ridiculous. Because it is. Those are not the words of someone being dramatic or trying to gain sympathy. Those are the words of someone who is in actual physical pain, who has an actual injury history with this exact area of her body, who played through it anyway because that is what she does, and who is now being told by the officials responsible for protecting players that she brought it on herself. When she asked for an explanation, the referee told her she misread the contact. And then, in what might be the single most tone-deaf moment from an official in recent memory, that same referee told Clark she had initiated the contact. Clark's response to that was exactly what you would expect. "You can't knee me in the leg, knock me over, and then be told I initiated it." She said it clearly. She said it without hesitation. And she was right. What makes this moment so much bigger than just a bad call in one game is the context surrounding it. This is not happening in isolation. Clark has been choked, elbowed, kneed, and shoved repeatedly over the course of this season. She missed 5 games earlier this year with a back injury. She came back on a 25-minute restriction, playing hurt, doing everything her coaching staff asked. And on her home court, in front of 17,000 fans, in a game her team desperately needed, she got kneed in the quad with a referee standing right there and got absolutely nothing for it. The reaction online was immediate and overwhelming. Analysts, fans, former players, the consensus was almost universal. The call was missed. The explanation was unacceptable. And what came next from the Indiana Fever's own sideline would somehow make the whole situation even worse. When a referee misses a call, that happens. Sports are fast. Angles are bad sometimes. Contact gets misread. Nobody is expecting perfection from officials because perfection in real-time officiating is not possible. What fans, players, and coaches are asking for, what they have every right to ask for, is honesty, accountability, some version of "we got that one wrong." That is not a complicated request. What Clark got instead was a chain of explanations so disconnected from what actually happened on the floor that it almost felt like a different play was being described entirely. The referee told Clark she misread the contact. Fine, that is at least an acknowledgement that something was seen. But then the same official followed that up by telling Clark she had initiated the contact. Think about what that means in the context of what was visible on camera. Clark caught the ball. She went up. Stokes came in and put a knee directly into her quad. Clark made the basket, hit the floor, and got up limping. In what version of that sequence is Clark the one who initiated anything? The explanation is not just wrong. It is the kind of wrong that makes you question whether the explanation is even being offered in good faith. Clark currently has 5 technical fouls on the season. 8 triggers an automatic suspension. That context matters enormously here because what happened at that referee encounter could easily have resulted in a technical. The fact that it did not that Clark dropped F-bombs loudly enough for the cameras to catch every word, confronted the official directly, and still only received a warning, tells you something. It tells you that even the officiating crew understood on some level that they had made a mistake. You do not give a warning instead of a technical to a player going off at a referee unless you already know your crew got it wrong. That is not generosity. That is damage control. And the league's retroactive response was just as revealing. Reports confirmed that the WNBA went back and fined Alyssa Thomas following review of a separate earlier incident involving Clark. The league has demonstrated, in other words, that it has the ability to look at plays after the fact and take action. That mechanism exists. It has been used. The question that nobody in the league's front office seems eager to answer is why that same standard of retroactive review is not being applied consistently across every incident involving Clark's physical safety. There is also a broader conversation happening in the media and among analysts about the pattern of physicality directed at Clark specifically. The framing from some corners has been that this is simply the way the game is played at the highest level. That elite players get tested. That physical defense is a sign of respect, not malice. And look, there is some truth buried in that argument. Elite players do get targeted. The best players in every league face elevated physicality because opponents understand the threat they represent. That is real. But there is a line between hard, physical, competitive basketball and the kind of repeated, uncalled contact that results in actual injuries and missed games. Clark sat out 2025 with injuries. She came back this season already managing her body carefully enough to be on a minutes restriction. She has 2 quad contusions in her recent medical history, and she just took a direct knee to that same area. At some point, the argument that this is just how basketball works starts to sound less like context and more like an excuse for something that should not be happening without consequence. What is particularly striking is the way Clark herself handled the aftermath. She did not deflect. She did not offer carefully worded non-answers designed to protect herself from fines. She said exactly what happened to her body, exactly why the officiating was unacceptable, and exactly what she felt about it. No performance, no theatrics beyond the initial confrontation. Just a player stating the facts about her own physical experience clearly and without apology. Compare that to the league's communication around this incident, the explanation offered to Clark, the explanation offered to Stephanie White, the response at the press conference. At every level, the institutional response to a clearly missed call on a clearly visible piece of contact was deflection dressed up in official language. And the technical fouls number is not a minor footnote here. 5 technicals on the season, with 8 being the threshold for a mandatory suspension, means Clark is operating with very little margin for exactly the kind of frustration she expressed on Wednesday night. If the officiating continues at its current level, if Clark continues absorbing contact that goes uncalled, the mathematical reality is that her emotional responses to legitimate grievances could end up costing her games before the season is over. She would be suspended not because she did anything wrong, but because the league's officiating created the conditions for her to reach that threshold. That is a problem the WNBA needs to reckon with. Not eventually, not in an off-season review, not in a carefully worded press release. Now, because what is happening on the floor is visible, it is documented, and it is impacting one of the most important players the league has ever had. And somehow, the most damaging response to all of this did not come from the officials or the league. It came from Clark's own sideline. There are press conferences that define a coach's relationship with their player. Moments where the person standing at the podium either stands up for what happened on the floor or finds a way to avoid it. Those moments matter. Players watch them. Fans watch them. The rest of the league watches them. And what Stephanie White said, or more accurately, what she carefully did not say, after the Valkyries game is going to be talked about for a while. When White was asked about the no call on the Stokes play, she had already been given the same explanation Clark received. The officials told her that Clark initiated the contact. White's response at the podium was delivered with what reporters in the room described as a touch of sarcasm. She said simply that they told her Clark initiated the contact, And then she added that Clark seems to always be initiating the contact. She said it twice. And then she told the reporter she was trying not to get fined. Let's be fair to Stephanie White for a moment, because the context matters. Coaches in professional leagues operate under real financial consequences for criticizing officiating publicly. White was not wrong to acknowledge that constraint. She said it herself, openly, which at least demonstrates some level of transparency about why she was not being more direct. She is not allowed to say what she actually thinks without risking a fine. That is a genuine limitation of her position. But here is the problem. On June 24th, White stood at a different podium and called a play involving Clark absolutely unacceptable. She said it 5 times in one press conference. She was passionate, she was clear, and she did not hold back. That was the press conference following the Alyssa Thomas incident, and White's willingness to call it out publicly, repeatedly, on camera, with obvious emotion, was one of the moments that made fans feel like the coaching staff was genuinely in Clark's corner. The contrast between that moment and what happened after the Valkyries game is jarring. Not subtle, not something you have to look hard to find. It is sitting right there in the footage. One event gets 5 repetitions of absolutely unacceptable. Another event, where Clark is kneed in the quad by an opponent, falls to the floor, and is then told by the referee she caused it, gets a sarcastic comment and a mention of not wanting to get fined. Analysts and fans watching the press conference were not kind about it. The prevailing response was that White had essentially thrown Clark under the bus with a smile on her face. That instead of using whatever language was available to her within the constraints of league rules to make clear she disagreed with the officiating crew's explanation, White chose the path of least resistance. The sarcasm was readable. Most people watching understood she did not actually believe Clark was initiating contact. But sarcasm is not the same as support. And in the moments after your franchise player limps to the locker room with a fresh quad injury on top of an existing back issue, sarcasm is not what anyone needs to hear from their head coach. Here is the other layer that makes this particularly uncomfortable. Clark herself was more direct at that press conference than her own coach. Clark said the ref cannot miss that call. She said it hurts. She said it is ridiculous. She said you cannot knee someone in the leg and knock them over. Those are clear, unambiguous statements about what happened. Her coach, standing at the same podium a few minutes later, offered sarcasm and a reference to trying not to get fined. The messaging from the Indiana Fever sideline in the aftermath of one of the clearest missed calls of the season was, at best, mixed. At worst, it gave the impression that even the people responsible for protecting Clark's well-being on a professional level were more focused on managing the situation than addressing it. Now, to be completely fair, White is operating within a system that punishes coaches financially for saying what many of them are clearly thinking. That system is its own problem. The WNBA's fining structure around officiating criticism effectively silences the people closest to the game from being honest about what they see every night. White is not the villain in this story, but she is the person who stood at that podium, and the words she chose landed the way they landed. There is also a broader coaching question worth examining here. Clark is a franchise-level player. She is the person around whom the entire Indiana Fever rebuild is centered. When that player is getting kneed in the quad on her home court, and the official explanation is that she initiated it, the head coach's response at the podium is not a minor detail. It is a statement about priorities, about whose version of events the organization is willing to publicly support. The fans who watched that press conference noticed, the analysts who covered it noticed, and you can be certain Clark noticed too. Because what happened next, the game itself, the injury picture, the back-to-back schedule looming, was about to make everything that happened at that podium feel even more consequential than it already did. Here is something that gets lost in all of the officiating conversation, in all of the outrage about the quad shot and the press conference and the league's non-response. Clark still played. She still competed. She still found moments in that game that reminded everyone watching exactly why this particular player generates the kind of attention and emotion that she does. And she did all of it while managing a back injury, playing on a minute's restriction, and eventually absorbing a direct blow to a part of her body that has already cost her significant time in her young career. That context matters when you look at what actually happened between the lines on Wednesday night. The Golden State Valkyries came into Gainbridge Fieldhouse as one of the hottest teams in the league. Sitting at 18-6, they carried the #1 defense in the WNBA into a building that was electric with 17,000 fans looking for a statement win. Indiana needed this game. They had just dropped out of sole possession of first place in the Eastern Conference, and a loss would drop them into a tie with the Atlanta Dream in a conference that was getting tighter by the week. Golden State made their intentions clear immediately. The Valkyries' defensive pressure was suffocating from the opening tip, and Indiana could not find any rhythm against it. The Fever went into an early hole, a 12-2 deficit that quieted the crowd, and immediately put Clark in a position where she needed to do more than her body was probably asking her to do. At halftime, Clark had 2 points on 1 of 5 shooting. 2 points on her home court in a game her team needed. Against a defense that was daring her to beat them even on her best night, she was doing it on a night that was the furthest thing from her best. But then the third quarter happened. Indiana went on a 17-4 run that completely flipped the game. The energy in the building shifted. The crowd woke back up. And right in the middle of that run, Clark produced what many people in the building and watching at home were calling the play of the season. She stole the ball, pushed up the floor, launched a 3 that didn't go in, ran down her own rebound, and then hit Aaliyah Boston with a behind-the-back spin pass that found Boston perfectly positioned for a 3-pointer. It was the kind of play that makes you stop and rewatch it. The kind of play that requires anticipation, creativity, and a feel for the game that cannot be coached or manufactured. You either have that vision or you do not, and Clark has it in a way that is genuinely rare. That play in the third quarter of a game where she was shooting under 20% from 3 over her last 3 games, playing hurt on a minute's restriction, told you everything about what kind of player Clark is when the game matters. Then the Valkyries answered. A 12-4 Golden State run erased the lead Indiana had fought so hard to build. The fourth quarter was not competitive. The Valkyries closed the game out convincingly, and the final score was 88-75. Indiana fell to 14-10 on the season, dropping into a first-place tie with Atlanta in the Eastern Conference. Golden State improved to 18-7 and made a significant statement about where they stand as a team. Clark's final numbers tell the story of a brutal night: 4 of 14 from the field, 1 of 8 from 3, 13 points, 6 assists. Stephanie White's challenge in the fourth quarter was unsuccessful, and Indiana lost a timeout because of it. 11 first-half turnovers that Golden State converted into 11 points. That turnover number is significant. Against a defense as good as Golden State's, you cannot give them that many extra possessions and expect to win a basketball game. But here is the thing about Clark's stat line. 13 points and 6 assists on a night when you are shooting with a quad contusion on a leg that already has a back injury behind it. Against the best defense in the league, on limited minutes, that is not a failure. That is a player grinding through circumstances that most people sitting in the stands or watching from home have no physical frame of reference for. The 1 of 8 from 3 will get circled and analyzed. The 15.8% from deep over her last 3 games will come up in conversations about her shooting slump. But the context around those numbers is doing a lot of work that the raw stats alone cannot communicate. Clark has been here before. The 2025 season, 13 games played, multiple quad contusions, weeks of watching from the bench in street clothes, was the kind of season that would have derailed a lot of players. She came back from it. She came back on a minute's restriction with a back that was still finding its way, and she started competing at a level that had Indiana sitting at the top of the Eastern Conference before Wednesday night. The basketball was real. The fight was real. And the injury she was managing while all of it was happening was real in a way that every Fever fan heading into a back-to-back weekend had every reason to be deeply, genuinely concerned about. The word contusion sounds clinical, medical, the kind of term that gets used in an injury report and gets forgotten between news cycles because it does not carry the same immediate weight as words like fracture or tear. But for anyone who watched the Indiana Fever through the 2025 season, the word contusion, specifically the word quad contusion, carries a completely different emotional weight. It carries the memory of a season that essentially never happened. Clark had 2 quad contusions during 2025. 2. She played 13 games that entire season. 13. In a league where every game matters for playoff positioning, for momentum, for the development of a young roster still learning to play alongside each other, Clark was available for 13 of them. And when she was not available, the Fever were a different team. Anyone watching them knows that. The difference between Indiana with Clark on the floor and Indiana without her is not a matter of degree. It is a matter of identity. So when Clark went down on Wednesday night, when she took that knee to the quad, went to the locker room, and came back to play 26 minutes, the people who know her injury history were not reassured by her return. They were watching every step she took. They were cataloging every moment where she favored that leg, every play where her movement looked slightly different from what it normally looks like, because they have seen this before. They know what the beginning of a quad problem looks like for this player, and Wednesday night had the visual language of something familiar in the worst possible way. Clark said after the game that she was not worried about the leg. Take that at face value and it sounds fine. A player takes a hit, plays through it, comes out on the other side and says she is okay. That happens all the time in professional sports. But Clark also said she was not sure what her availability would look like for the upcoming back-to-back before the Valkyries game even started. Before she took the knee to the quad, she was already uncertain about whether her body could handle consecutive nights. That is the baseline she was operating from. Now layer a fresh quad contusion on top of that baseline. A back that is still in recovery mode. A minutes restriction that tells you the medical staff is managing her workload carefully because they understand the risk of overloading a body that has been through what hers has been through. And then add the schedule. Seattle Storm on Friday, New York Liberty on Saturday. Back-to-back home games. 2 games in 2 nights against 2 legitimate opponents in a week where Indiana desperately needs wins to maintain their position in the Eastern Conference. That combination of factors, the quad, the back, the schedule, the stakes, is the kind of scenario that should make every Fever fan genuinely nervous. Not panicked, but nervous. Because the variables are stacking in a direction that anyone who followed 2025 closely recognizes. There is also a broader picture worth considering here. The physicality Clark has absorbed this season has not been random or isolated. Reports and fan commentary throughout the year have pointed to a pattern of elevated physical contact directed at Clark specifically. She has been choked, she has been elbowed, she has been kneed. She missed 5 games with a back injury earlier, in the season that many observers connected directly to the level of physical play she was enduring without adequate officiating protection. She came back from that back injury on a restricted schedule, and less than a week into her return, she absorbed another significant blow to a different part of her body. The cumulative effect of all of that on a human being's physical health is not theoretical. It is mathematical. Bodies absorb a certain amount before they stop being able to absorb more. Clark's 2025 season was evidence of what happens when that threshold gets crossed. The 2026 season has already included a back injury and now a fresh quad contusion in the exact spot where her most significant previous injuries occurred. The 5 technical fouls add another dimension to this that goes beyond the physical. Clark is 3 technicals away from an automatic suspension. She is playing in a league where the officiating is generating legitimate controversy about consistency and player protection. She is going to get hit again. She is going to have moments where her frustration is completely justified by what is happening on the floor. And if those moments result in technical fouls, because the officials call the reaction but not the original contact, she could find herself suspended not because of anything she did wrong, but because the conditions around her created a pressure situation that had a mathematical endpoint. That is not a minor concern. That is a structural problem. And right now, the people with the authority to address it, the league, the officials, the review process, have not given any public indication that they understand the urgency. Clark's health is not just a personal matter for her and the Fever. It is a league-wide concern. She is the most visible, most discussed, most commercially significant player in the WNBA right now. The league's growth, the television deals, the attendance numbers, all of it exists in a landscape that Clark helped create. and the officiating that is supposed to protect her is currently the biggest threat to her being available to play in it. What happens next on that front is the question nobody in the league seems to have a good answer for yet. None of what happened on July 15th appeared out of nowhere. That is the part of this story that tends to get flattened when individual moments go viral. The clip of the knee, the clip of Clark confronting the referee, the clip of White's press conference. Each of those moments exists inside a much longer story that has been building since before this season even started. And understanding that story changes the way you see Wednesday night entirely. Go back to before the 2026 season. Clark played 13 games in 2025. 13. The reasons for that are documented and visible: the injuries, the physical demands, the quad contusions that kept her out for extended stretches. But the conversations happening around those injuries, the questions about whether the level of physicality directed at Clark specifically was contributing to her availability problems, were present all last year too. They were not new conversations in July of 2026. They were ongoing conversations that Wednesday night gave a very sharp, very visual piece of evidence to support. This season, before the Valkyries game, Clark had already missed 5 games with a back injury. She came back from that on a 25-minute restriction, which in practical terms means the medical staff was managing her minutes carefully enough to suggest they were genuinely concerned about what happens if she overextends. Playing on a 25-minute restriction while your team is fighting for first place in the Eastern Conference means every second you are on the floor is being calculated and protected. And she was still absorbing contact that was going uncalled within that restricted window. Analysts covering the league have pointed to something that goes beyond simple physicality. The word resentment has come up repeatedly in discussions about Clark's situation. The idea that some opponents, aware of her profile, her commercial success, her rapid ascent to the top of the league's cultural conversation, approach games against her with an elevated edge. That is, to be clear, the framing offered by commentators and observers. It is speculative. But it is speculative in a way that has a lot of visible evidence behind it, and that evidence has been accumulating over 2 seasons now. The WNBA's officiating has been a topic of discussion that extends well beyond Clark. Players, coaches, and analysts across the league have raised questions about consistency in how games are called. But the Clark conversation has become the focal point of that broader discussion, because the incidents involving her have been the most visible, the most documented on camera, and the most directly connected to the availability of a player whose importance to the league's current growth trajectory is difficult to overstate. The Alyssa Thomas situation earlier in the season, an incident significant enough that it generated multiple press conferences and an eventual fine from the league after review, demonstrated that the WNBA has the mechanism to go back and address calls that were missed or handled incorrectly in real time. The league used that mechanism. The league fined Thomas after review. The precedent for retroactive action exists and has been applied. What fans and analysts are asking, loudly and with increasing frustration, is why that same standard has not been applied with the same consistency to every incident involving Clark. The Thomas incident generated 5 repetitions of absolutely unacceptable from Stephanie White on a podium. The Stokes knee generated a sarcastic comment about always initiating contact. Those are the same coach, the same player, within the same season. The distance between those 2 responses is significant, and people noticed. There is also the competitive dimension of this conversation that sometimes gets lost. Every game Clark misses because of injury is a game the Fever play without their most important player. Every minute she sits on the bench because of a minute's restriction is a minute Indiana does not have their best option on the floor. In a conference race this tight, where the margin between first place and a less favorable playoff position is measured in fractions of games, the availability question is not abstract. It directly determines what happens to this team's season. 14-10. That is where the Fever sit after Wednesday night, tied with Atlanta for first in the Eastern Conference. Not out of contention, not in a crisis, but in a position where losing Clark to injury again would fundamentally change the equation. The math of the Eastern Conference race gives you very little margin for losing your best player. and Wednesday night added a fresh variable to that equation that did not exist before tip-off. The back-to-back schedule heading into the weekend, Seattle Friday, New York Saturday, was already something Clark had expressed uncertainty about before the Valkyries game. A fresh quad contusion changes that uncertainty calculation significantly. Every hour between Wednesday night and Friday tip-off, every treatment session, every conversation between Clark and the medical staff is going to be measured against that same injury history that 2025 left behind. And the league, the officiating crew, the review process, none of them have offered anything in the aftermath of Wednesday night that suggests the next time Clark steps on the floor, anything is going to be different. That is the pattern. That is the story that Wednesday night's moment belongs to. And the question of whether it changes, whether the people with the power to change it choose to, is one that every single person watching this league is going to be looking for an answer to. Starting Friday night, step back from the specific game, the specific call, the specific press conference moment, and look at what is actually happening here from a distance. Because there is a larger story inside all of this, that the moment-to-moment coverage of individual incidents can make it easy to miss. The WNBA is in a genuinely significant period of its existence right now. The league's growth over the last several years has been documented in television ratings, attendance numbers, merchandise sales, social media engagement, all of the metrics that sports leagues use to measure their own health. That growth has not happened in a vacuum. It has happened in a specific context, and part of that context is the attention that Clark's presence in the league has generated. That is not a slight against any other player in the WNBA. There is legitimate talent across the entire league, and the growth of the game is a collective achievement. But the concentrated, mainstream, casual fan-reaching attention that Clark specifically brings is a documented fact. The numbers support it. And here is where the officiating conversation becomes something bigger than just a debate about foul calls. A league that is in the middle of a genuine growth moment, that has television partners paying attention, that has casual fans tuning in who might not have watched women's basketball 5 years ago. That league has a significant interest in ensuring its most visible players are available, healthy, and competing in games that showcase the quality of the sport. That is not a business calculation that conflicts with protecting players. It is the same calculation. Protecting players and protecting the product are, in this case, the exact same thing. The officiating conversation, the injury conversation, the physical treatment conversation, all of it is ultimately a conversation about whether the WNBA's leadership understands what it is right now and is willing to protect it. Commentators have used language like riding the cash cow or a rising tide lifts all boats to describe what the league should be doing with Clark's moment. The underlying argument is sound regardless of how it gets phrased. When a league has a player who connects with fans on the scale Clark does, the smart institutional move is to ensure that player is on the floor, healthy, visible, and in games that matter. What is happening instead, at least from the perspective of observers watching closely, is that the officiating is creating conditions where Clark's physical safety is genuinely at risk, where her technical foul count is creeping toward an automatic suspension, and where the league's public response has been so muted that fans are filling the silence with their own conclusions. And those conclusions are not flattering to the institution. There is also the credibility question that the officiating consistency issue raises. Sports leagues survive and grow on the credibility of their competition. Fans invest in leagues because they believe, fundamentally, that the games they are watching are being adjudicated fairly. The moment that belief erodes, the moment people start watching and thinking not about who is going to win, but about what bad call is going to decide it, the league has a problem that goes beyond any individual game or player. Commentators have drawn comparisons to entertainment-based sports formats to describe what the WNBA is risking if the officiating conversation continues without resolution. That is a brutal comparison, and most people making it are doing so out of frustration rather than literal belief. But the frustration behind it is real, and the league's leadership should be treating it as a warning signal. For Clark specifically, the position she is in right now is a complicated one. She is not the type of player who quietly absorbs unfair treatment and says nothing. Wednesday night proved that again, very clearly. She speaks honestly about what is happening to her body and why it is unacceptable. She is willing to say, on camera, in direct language, that she got kneed in the leg and the ref cannot miss that. That honesty is part of what makes her compelling to watch and follow. It is also part of what has her sitting at 5 technical fouls, with 8 being the suspension threshold. The league's technical foul structure, applied in the current officiating environment, is essentially creating a situation where Clark's authentic responses to legitimate grievances could end up costing her games. If she gets hit, if the call is missed, if she reacts, and she will react because she is a competitor and the reactions are proportional to the situations that produce them. The technical goes on her record, not on the contact that generated the response. 3 more of those and she is suspended. Suspended not for anything she did wrong in isolation, but for reacting to things that should have been called in the first place. That is the structural problem. And it is sitting there, visible and documented, waiting for someone with the authority to address it to decide that it matters enough to change. Fans are paying attention to whether that happens. Analysts are paying attention. The television partners who are carrying these games are paying attention. And Clark, playing on a restricted schedule with a back injury, and now a fresh quad contusion heading into a back-to-back, is paying attention in the most personal way possible. Because ultimately, this is about more than officiating philosophy or coaching press conference responses or league policy. It is about whether the people running this league are going to take care of the players competing in it, starting with the one whose availability they should be most invested in protecting. Here is where everything lands. A player who has already given up chunks of her career to injury walked onto her home court on July 15, 2026, absorbed a direct blow to the exact part of her body that derailed an entire previous season, made the basket anyway, got no call, confronted the referee with raw and justified frustration, walked off limping, came back and played 26 minutes, and then watched her own head coach respond to the whole situation with sarcasm at a podium. The officiating missed it. The league's explanation was tone-deaf, and the back-to-back schedule heading into the weekend was already terrifying before any of Wednesday night happened. What this moment reveals is not new information. It is the clearest, most visible evidence, yet of something that has been building for 2 seasons. A gap between the standard of care Clark deserves and the standard she is actually receiving. Whether the WNBA closes that gap before it costs Clark more time, more games, or more physical damage is the most important question the league is facing right now. Drop your thoughts in the comments. Is the officiating going to cost Clark the rest of her season? And what should the WNBA actually do about it?